Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you please rise as we welcome the procession inside the venue? Thank you so much.
It's working. Yes. Good evening, everyone. You may be seated. Wow, that was quite powerful to be able to say that. Friends, colleagues, it is my privilege this evening to welcome all of you to the professorial inaugural lecture of Professor Emanuel, Manne, as I know him, Bylund-Spångberg. And I was just told as we were talking outside how that needs to be pronounced. The A is a little circle on top. I'm going to do a brief introduction to point to his career. A fascinating topic, the topic of language. I was sharing with him in discussion earlier on how fascinating I find it. It's up there with the universe. Where did the universe come from? Why are we here? Why do we exist? Why do we think? And the acquisition of language, how we acquire it, is for me, lies at that same level. How we acquire it, how we lose it, how we learn different languages. And that's the focus area of study of the Department of General Linguistics in our faculty, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. A hearty welcome as well to Dr. Emanuel, our registrar, who's here from the rectorate, and my left hand and my right hand, Professor Pasti Ruert, our Vice Dean for Learning and Teaching, and Professor Lindy Heineken, our Vice Dean for Research. But back to the focus of this evening. Manne, Professor Bylund-Spångberg, is a prominent figure in the field of linguistics. And that by prominent, in academic parlance, usually means well known by his peers internationally for his work in the field of linguistics, or to be more accurate, psycholinguistics. And psycholinguistics, as the word intimates, is the psychological study of language. He's one of those rare academics. I always sit up when somebody tells me they have not one PhD, but two PhDs. I always think to myself, going through that once is enough. But in terms of his academic qualifications, he holds two doctorates, having earned a PhD in bilingualism research and in Spanish linguistics from Stockholm University in 2008 and 2009, respectively. And you may have intimated from his name that that's also his country of origin, but he's been in his adopted country, South Africa, for quite a number of years, and we're very happy to have him here, I may add. After completing his PhDs, he gained experience in various postdoctoral positions at prestigious institutions, including Stockholm University in Sweden, University of Maryland, and that's in the United States, and then also our neighboring university, the University of the Western Cape. And then he joined us here at Stellenbosch University. He has held professorships at Linnaeus University, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, focusing on Swedish as a second language, and also at Stockholm University, focusing on bilingualism research. His research interests lie in understanding the differences between how children and adults acquire and lose languages. One of the populations he studied in this regard are children with adoptive backgrounds. So when a child is adopted, and importantly at what age, do they retain the mother tongue, so to speak, or do they lose it as they acquire the new language? Because, of course, children tend to acquire their new language early, from prior to birth, actually, already, while at the same time, as adoptive children, losing their first language, or retaining it, depending on the age. Another main strand in his research is the relationship between language and thought, the psychological study of language, and whether speakers of different languages think differently about the world. Here he has particularly studied how different metaphors for time influence the perception of time in monolingual and multilingual individuals. This line of research has garnered considerable attention worldwide, again returning to the word prominent and internationally recognized. And this is indicated by a total of no less than 4 million unique clicks and shares through media coverage on 4 different continents. His research on these areas have concerned languages such as Afrikaans, Swedish, English, German, Spanish, Dolio, Kiswahili, isiXhosa, isiZulu, and Mandarin Chinese. And this work has been undertaken in collaboration with researchers from Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. Here at Stellenbosch, he leads the Multilingualism and Cognition Laboratory, which has been functioning, I think, for a number of years. Is it 4, 5, 6 years already? And this is the only one of its kind in Africa, which is dedicated to studying the workings of the multilingual mind. The laboratory plays a key role in efforts to broaden the scope of cognitive sciences on a global scale. The latest addition to this lab is an electroencephalogram machine, perhaps more readily known to all of you as an EEG machine. And I found out from our faculty manager, who has some mastery of Greek, that the word encephalo refers in Greek to head, als Deutsch Kopf. And of course, this machine measures brain waves, brain patterns. And this allows research on how, or a focus on how the brain processes language in real time. Cutting edge research. We've just now, on Mana's initiative, have acquired this EEG machine. I was amazed, it doesn't come cheap. But we have one now, and I think it's going to make a real difference in the research that the laboratory will be doing under your leadership, Mana. So it's now my pleasure to call on Professor Bylund-Spångberg to deliver his inaugural professorial lecture, which is entitled Language Diversity and the Human Mind. Mana?
Right, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm happy to finally stand here. There's been traveling and a pandemic in between and everything, but now we're here. And it's actually a good thing because this has given me some time now to do some of the things I would have said I was going to do had I given this lecture 8 years ago instead. So I'll give a little overview of the research that I do and the context in which I do it. And I've given this an epic title, Language Diversity and the Human Mind. And so linguistics is situated within the larger field of cognitive science that seeks to understand the workings of the human mind. And language is often described as a species-specific capacity. No other animal has a communication system that is as complex as language is, but crucially perhaps also as diverse as human language. So some languages are spoken, other languages are signed, some languages have 20 vowels, other languages have 3 vowels, some languages have 5 clicks, other languages have no clicks, and so on. So it's a very complex communication system, but also a very diverse communication system that differs across the globe and across modalities as well. So modern linguistics is said to have started in the late 1800s, more or less. And in the early 1900s, there was a great interest in this diversity of language. And you had scholars coming from Europe working in the United States, and they were struck by the diversity of languages found in the United States, of Native American languages, and how different these languages were, not only from English and European languages, but from other Native American languages spoken on the continent. So there was a great interest in linguistic diversity, and the fact that some languages would lack a word for, say, tomorrow, or the word for tomorrow and the day after would be the same. How does this affect the way that you think about time? And with this interest in linguistic diversity came also the interest in whether language affects the way that you think. And if you have a given word for a phenomenon, does that mean that you categorize that phenomenon differently? If you have 10 different words, do you categorize color space differently than if you only have 3 color words? And this was at the forefront of research up until the mid-1900s, more or less. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, research focus turned quite a lot, and instead of looking what was distinct about different ethnic groups and their languages, instead people sought to find commonalities in this immense diversity. And one of the prominent scholars in this regard is Noam Chomsky, who said that actually if you want to study language and study the essence of language, you don't need to go out and do field research. You can do what's called armchair linguistics instead. So you sit and you think, you introspect, try to get to the workings of language, how languages are built up. And you can get quite far with this. I'm not dissing armchair linguistics, but I do think that collecting data also has its values. So Chomsky says that you can propose general principles for how languages work across the globe just by studying English. This is actually something that we can do, and this is actually something that people did as well for a very long time, and very successfully so. Managed to find abstract operations that underlie linguistic structure. And it seems like the pendulum has swung again now, and for the past decade or so, there's been a renewed interest in linguistic diversity, and the notion of weird has been coined as well. So weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And it's been said that there's a weird problem in the cognitive sciences, which means that most of our knowledge comes from weird populations. And not only weird, but about most of the studies on the human mind are done on American undergraduate students of psychology. That's the default population for studying the human mind. So needless to say, this subsample isn't perhaps representative of human diversity. And the argument is being made that we need to broaden the scope if we want to understand how the human mind works, how we can acquire languages, what language does to the mind as well. We need to broaden the sampling. So before doing that, before looking at the consequences, what I've done with my colleagues and students is to actually try to gauge this weird bias in the literature. So we went through manually about 8,000 empirical papers studied in the field of psycholinguistics, which is the psychological study of language. And we looked at journals that are general in scope, such as Nature and Science, that occasionally publish research on psycholinguistics, and then dedicated, specialized psycholinguistic journals as well. And we looked at what languages are being studied here, what are the most commonly studied languages, and where does the research take place as well. So when we look at linguistic diversity, which language do you think is the most commonly studied in the psychology of language? I kind of hinted at it already. It's a low odds guess. It's English. So around 45% of all studies concern English here. And then we have a split second place between a few different languages, German, Dutch, French, and Mandarin Chinese. And they occupy about 5% of the research concerns these languages. Spanish comes in quite close as well, Italian, Japanese, and so on. So one might look at this list and say, well, doesn't this just reflect the number of speakers that you have of these languages? We know that English is worldwide, has the greatest number of speakers, both native speakers, but also second language speakers, and combined, it's number one by far. Mandarin Chinese as well, it's the second largest language after English. Spanish as well. But there are a few languages here that are missing, that are actually among the biggest languages in the world. So Hindi is not on the list. Arabic isn't on the list either. Portuguese, Russian, and Urdu are missing from this list. So it's not just that the list reflects the languages that are most widely spoken. In fact, some of these languages, like Hindi and Urdu, barely appears at all in the sample of 8,000 studies. there's about a handful of studies dealing with these languages, and not for lack of speakers. What we find as well is that, quite interesting, so if you do research on a less commonly studied language, you're less likely to get cited as well. And I think, well, maybe this is because if you do research on English, then you cite other researchers doing research on English. But this isn't language-specific studies. They just use English speakers often to illustrate a certain phenomenon. Also, less commonly studied languages are less likely to appear in journals such as Nature and Science. They're more likely to appear in the specialized journals of the field, whereas English and Mandarin Chinese are very commonly occurring in the general sciences outlets. You have the occasional exception, where somebody, some group of researchers traveled deep into the rainforest and they studied a community that is then representing kind of a very far removed language and community. And then the last one, and I find this one quite interesting. Studies on less commonly studied languages more often include the name of the language in the title of the studies. So if you look at stress in the perception of vowels, in English you won't mention that you're studying English, but if you do it in Sami or in the Luo, then you say stress perception in Sami or in the Luo, which gives this research more of a particularistic feel. And you might look at the title and you think, okay, this is specific to that language. I'll go with a title that doesn't specify language, which will then, in all likelihood, be English, which is still specific to English, just not mentioned in the title. Then we have where the research is being carried out. And as you can see, the global north, and America in particular, are the largest producers of psycholinguistic studies. This is where the research is being carried out, and this is where the researchers are affiliated. So you can see in the top map, for instance, Africa and Southeast Asia are quite colorful, but in the bottom map, some of these colors disappear, and that means that people went to these countries to study something, and then they went back to write up the research. And that's good, because sometimes we wouldn't know anything about this phenomena if people didn't go there to study them. On the other hand, this might illustrate the risk of what we call helicopter science, where researchers from privileged institutions go and they document and dash, they get data and then they leave, without involvement from local scholars or even sometimes ethical clearance. So the argument has been made, and this is something that Prof. Leysens mentioned in the introduction as well, that if we want to understand the human ability for language, we can study language acquisition, and crucially we can study how we acquire multiple languages, something that tests the limits of the human capacity for language. And I'll show you some interesting contrasts here. So this is where research on multilingualism is being carried out mostly in the world. So it's a similar pattern even in this sub-area of psycholinguistics. And we can think, okay, well this is what most maps of scientific production would look like. You have a concentration in the global north, then you have China and Japan as stakeholders in the global south. So there's nothing different about this map than any other map. And that's true. But when you contrast this map with where you find multilingualism, where multilingualism is most common in the world, it's quite a contrast. That map looks like this. This is where we find multilingualism, most commonly worldwide in Africa, Southeast Asia, and India. And this is where multilingualism is being studied. So clearly this must have some kind of consequences for how we understand our objects of learning. And you can see very often in most research, multilingualism is conceptualized as something that happens when you either learn a new language in the classroom or you move to a new country, you acquire a new language. In South Africa, you can be multilingual without ever having left the comfort of your home or the playground. Also assumptions about how we only express emotions in our first language. If I burn myself on the fire, then I swear in Swedish. Yeah, I do, I might, but sometimes people don't, especially in South Africa, people don't always use the first language as swearing. There might be another language that is preferred for swearing as well. This has to do with the emotional ladenness of language. And different decisions are made if you operate in a second language, and if you're thinking in your second language than if you're thinking in your first language. So I'll show you an example here. There are 5 people that are about to be run over by a train. Now you can save them, but you can only save them by pushing down a person on the tracks that is heavy enough to stop the train. What would you do? Would you be a passive bystander, or would you actively save the 5 at the expense of one life? When people are confronted with this scenario in their first language, they will say, no, I won't do anything. I'll just stand and I will look at the 5 people getting killed. But if you present them with a scenario in their second language, then they will say, yeah, I'll probably push the man down and I will save the 5 lives rather than just watching 5 people die, even if that entails sacrificing one innocent stranger. So this has been found in quite a few studies, and it's been found with risk-taking as well. So if people are confronted with a scenario that includes risk, you're more likely not to take the risk if you hear about this in your second language than if you hear about it in your first language. You're more rational of a thinker when you speak in your second language, or when you operate in your second language, than in your mother tongue, which relates to this idea that the mother tongue has some kind of emotional attachment that you don't get with a second language. And people often say, well, this has far-reaching consequences for the United Nations, where people operate and big decisions are being taken in something that's not a first language. And then I always think, well, what about a country that has a highly multilingual population, like South Africa? If you take 2 random individuals from South Africa, the likelihood that they would share the same mother tongue is 11%. So it's a very multilingual country. We might have common languages that we use, but it's not necessarily common mother tongues. And what about decisions that South Africans make on a daily basis? What about decisions in Parliament? Decisions about load shedding and national coalition and all of that. Are they being taken in the second language? Would they be different if they were taken in the mother tongue instead? That's something that we don't know, but I don't know if this is a good or bad thing. I think it's a quite good finding that we have. So we've looked at this with colleagues and students, and this effect that you make different decisions depending on the language, first or second language, it doesn't seem to obtain in South Africa. People are not more inclined to push the stranger down from the footbridge if they're confronted with a scenario in the second language than in the first language. Which might mean that important decisions we make in daily life and in Parliament actually are not influenced by this otherwise arbitrary factor that would be language of operation. We zoom out a bit from this idea of, or from the area of multilingualism, and we look at other theoretical consequences that this biased focus on the English language has in the cognitive sciences. So, in the world's languages, words are built differently. You often have a stem of a word, and then either at the beginning of the stem or at the end of the stem, and sometimes in the middle of the stem as well, you insert a little thing called a morpheme that modifies the meaning of the stem. So in English, to make plurals, for instance, we add s, shoe, shoes, cloud, clouds, and so on. But in some languages, the same operation takes place in the beginning of the word. So in Xhosa, you would instead modify the beginning of the word, so it would go from different morpheme, depending on whether it's singular or plural. And the suffixing, when you change the end of the words, is more common across the world's languages, whereas the prefixing, heavy prefixing is found only in about 15% of the world's languages. So based on these findings that prefixing is less common, it's been suggested that maybe this has to do with the way the human mind is built. And it's been found that if we watch sequences of information, what comes at the beginning of those sequences is perceived as more important. And if I say shoe and shoes, what's important really is the shoe, not the plural of it. If I say dance or dancing, the ing isn't as central for information convention as the dance. So it's been said maybe this dominant pattern of suffixing is because this is how the human mind works. We pay attention to things that come at the beginning instead. So you can test this empirically. That's what we do. That's why I say that I like introspection, but I also like to get my hands dirty with data. And you have something called an apex design. So you have a target item. It's either a syllable or it is it's a shape. And the task of the participant here is to decide which either the pre-change or the post-change item is most similar to the target. So if I say, decide whether betate or tatebe is most similar to tate, then you must give your preference. So you see that the post-change item, we change the ending, and the pre-change item, we change the beginning. And the same goes for the shapes, okay? Because we don't want to play around with syllables here only. We want to use something that's not linguistic as well. Because if this idea that suffixing is more common has to do with how the human mind works, then we want something else but language to corroborate that idea as well. And we find then with these preferences that English speakers are indeed more likely to judge sequences with different endings as more similar to something like dance, dancing, and in this case, tate and tatebe. But speakers of Taraka, which is a Bantu language spoken in Kenya, have the opposite preference. So if something is similar at the end, it's judged as a better fit by speakers of these languages. And this holds both for the syllables but also for the shapes. Okay, so it's not a matter of judging linguistic material alone, but it's also how you judge differences and similarities between objects. So it's a very neat example of how language can influence the way that you think about things, how you perceive similarity and rate similarity between objects as an example here. This also suggests that this preference for suffixing and the idea that the human mind would work based on similarities with beginnings is really just an artifact from previous studies looking at English alone. If you only study English speakers with suffixing, with a suffixing tendency, you're not going to postulate any different hypotheses than this. So that's why you need to bring in this linguistic diversity to test whether this suffixing preference really reflects a design feature of the human mind or not. Okay, so I've given you some examples of the consequences of these biases. We've looked at the biases themselves as well, and I thought we would just briefly look into the future now. So, even though there is a bias in the sampling, in what languages get studied, it is changing. Sample diversity is improving. And this is shows from 2002, so the last 2 decades to 2021. English is losing ground as an object of study. It's still vastly dominant, but it is not as dominant as it used to be. And this language that is gaining ground, can you guess, or can you see which language that is? It's Mandarin Chinese. Mandarin Chinese is gaining ground as a quite prominent object of study. And along with this, geodiversity is also increasing. So again, the United States is losing ground as a major hub of knowledge production, and China is gaining ground quite significantly. From the global south, China and Israel are the 2 countries that have gained the most ground over the past 2 decades. And then locally, things are happening as well. So Tony mentioned in the introduction the Multilingualism and Cognition Laboratory that we have in the faculty, and it's the only psycholinguistic lab on the continent, the only lab that's dedicated to studying language and human cognition. And this year we will be getting brain imaging equipment. So anybody who has a science envy and want to dig into the brain and see how language works, are welcome to join us. And anybody who's just interested in this methodology without such envy is of course welcome as well. But it's a very exciting development, and it promises again to put Stellenbosch University and South Africa on the map. If you saw the heat maps, the southern tip of Africa wasn't pale. It's colored in, and we're happy to say that that's mainly because of the work being done at the laboratory. So that research is getting out as well. So we think that with the global trends of the shifting away from English and local initiatives such as the Multicog Lab, things are slowly changing. And I think that's a good outlook. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
So, thank you, Professor Bylund-Spångberg, if I get that pronunciation right, for your enlightening lecture on the interplay between multilingualism and cognitive science. Your insights into the biases within psycholinguistic research and the need for greater diversity in language studies are particularly thought-provoking. And I have to say, I think we will all reconsider the way we make decisions and try it in different languages to see if we can get it to a better outcome. And so I'll tell my colleagues in the rectorate that's the way to go. We are making all sorts of interesting decisions and have made so recently. And then I think it's also very important for us as an institution that is committed to multilingualism that this research is also being done, as you point out, at the southern tip of Africa, and that it's situated here. It's such a wonderful thing to know and to be proud of. I think we can be really proud to have your center and your laboratory in our midst. So all that remains for me is to congratulate you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I'll definitely come by to look at your machines.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon or good evening to everyone. So I'd just like to express our faculty's appreciation to our rectorate member, Dr. Retief, our registrar, for attending this evening. Also to Prof. Leysens, who is for his generous support. We don't know how generous it is, but hopefully it would be generous support in making this evening possible. And also a special welcome to Mana's family, friends, colleagues, and academic partners, collaborators here in person and online for sharing this wonderful event with all of us. Mana, it's really a privilege to have somebody like you in our faculty, of your stature and your academic caliber. And also, of course, as a valued member of the General Linguistics Department. When you were lecturing, giving your presentation, I just thought how much we at Stellenbosch are actually engrossed in the language debate around Afrikaans, but we seldom think of it as a semiotic system with all its complexities that affect the way we think and act and react. So on behalf of all of us, I just want to thank Mana for his profoundly interesting and thought-provoking inaugural lecture. I expect all of us here present today, especially myself, have gained new insights into the complex interplay between language, culture, and society. And I just thought when you were talking how I had most profound experiences recently when I had to give a presentation to parliamentarians in Brussels from all the former East Bloc countries, Georgia, and Ukraine and all that bunch of countries, and the Ukrainians refused, even though it was an Russian translation, the Ukrainians refused to speak Russian. In that debate, it was such a neat thing to know that language it's such a powerful tool embodied in so many ways it influences the way we behave and act and react. So before I close, I just want to have a final thanks to those people who have been involved in the planning and the execution of this event. Liesel van Kerwel from the Dean's Office, Amira Brown, are you here? Yes, Amina. And Cindy Arendse from the marketing team, as well as Justin Alberts from the communications team. So with that, I'd like to invite you all for light refreshments in the foyer. And now I ask you please to rise for the academic procession as Mana leads us out of the venue.